Taoism is not this quietist approach. It's not this, just me and forget about the rest of the world. It's much more about recognizing the interconnectedness with the world. So things that affect me is things that affect the world, and vice versa. I can affect the world by how I'm caring for myself, and that spreads out into other aspects of how life functions, because it's all connected and you can't have one without the other. So I want to welcome everybody again to Kinship Cafe, and excited to get started. Let me go ahead and pull up my screen here. Let's see, here we go. Everybody seeing my screen all right?
Yep.
All right. Well, today is, we're going to be jumping into chapter 7. And this one was a nice little surprise for me. One of the things I really appreciate about this class is that it forces me to look at things that I might otherwise easily kind of skip over. So as you're reading through the Daodejing, you might come across a particular chapter and you're like, that just didn't really speak to me or whatever. But in this case, this was one of those for me where at first I thought, well, this doesn't seem like there's a whole lot here, but then I had to dive in deeper because I knew I had to talk about it, and it opened up into something that was like quite a gem. I was really surprised and happy about that. So we'll see how this goes. I'm just going to go ahead and read through this, and then you guys can let me know what you think. So I'll just go ahead and read through this first, and then we'll kind of talk about it. It says, heaven is long, earth enduring, long and enduring, because they do not exist for themselves. Therefore, the sage steps back, but is always in front, stays outside, but is always within. No self-interest, self-fulfilled. So there's a couple things here I want to bring up kind of right off. And there seems to be kind of an interesting point that's being made in this first part, where we again have heaven and earth, Tian Di, being brought up as kind of, let's say, exemplars for the sage or for the Tao, the person following the Tao. And here they're talking about their enduring for a long time. And this was maybe one of the questions that would come up within classical Taoism that definitely got enhanced when you move into more of the religious version of Taoism about how do you live long. In fact, they kind of developed this whole idea about trying to cultivate immortality. So here, the question, what's being brought up is that, heaven is long and earth is enduring. How does this happen? What is the model that we might be able to apply? And it says, because they do not exist for themselves. And you're thinking, okay, well, this is an interesting idea, right? There's something about how heaven and earth function that doesn't have to do with them trying to do things for themselves, which obviously is kind of a personification, but we'll kind of break this down. But then in the next part, it says, therefore the sage, so the sage is going to follow the example, says, steps back, but is always in front, stays outside, but is always within. And then the final part, no self-interest, self is fulfilled. So it kind of creates this little paradox. It's basically like saying, in trying to do what you're not, let's see, how do we put this? Like, let's say that being self-fulfilled would be the goal. If the sage then says, well, I'm not interested in self-fulfillment, so then I'm going to practice no self-interest, then paradoxically what happens is you become self-fulfilled. But then it becomes kind of like this weird conundrum where it's almost like you're saying one thing, like, I don't want to do this one thing, but then you're actually getting that one thing. And so it's almost like the reason you're renouncing it is because you want it. It becomes kind of almost the opposite of what they're trying to express here. And the same thing here, steps back, but it's always in front, stays outside, but is always within. And the thing that concerns me about this translation is that it makes it seem like if the goal was not to get ahead, but by trying to not get ahead, you got ahead, then you're almost like right back in the same thing, right? It's like saying, you don't believe in capitalism, and so you're not chasing after, all this, big buckets of money, but by doing so, you end up with big buckets of money. It's kind of like almost becomes almost disingenuous as far as the approach. It's very kind of concerning the way this kind of lays out. So I'm going to bring up a different translation of this one that I think captures the ideas a lot better, and see where this takes us. So this was the Addiss and Lombardo, which is kind of the core text we use. And after we see where this chapter is going, the Addiss and Lombardo text actually works out pretty good. It's just you have to kind of think through it a little bit differently, because the way it's worded in English is a little bit misleading, but it still kind of retains the same ideas. So let me go with this next translation here. Heaven abides, the earth endures. The reason they endure and last long is because they are not self-born. So it's kind of an interesting initial change here, self-born. This is why those with wisdom are self-effacing, and the body of life is advanced. They get beyond themselves and preserve life. Isn't it because they are not selfish that they can complete themselves? Now, it might seem like this is very similar to the last one, but there's some subtle differences. And maybe before I go back, I'll just kind of see if you guys had any thoughts on this or anything that jumped out at you. And I can move back to any of the slides if you want.
You go back to the last one.
This one?
Yeah. I think to your point, the other translation, what did seem like it was like, if you don't think about yourself, you'll be good. Like, it was very, for the stage, like self-centered. It was almost like, here's the secret. And this is focused on like outside, like humanity as a whole, or like the life as a whole. It's like it's like a different perspective of why you should, like, why they're not self-centered and like the result of that.
Yeah. Anybody else have some thoughts?
I feel
it's like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dwayne.
Well, I was going to make an observation of how the translation is kind of saying this one is more focused on if you are a wise person, and the other one just says sage. So this seems more like for you if you are wise, and the other one says, sages sages know better. That's the kind of difference I'm seeing, and it's subtle here, but I still think they're kind of getting at the same point. Go ahead, Taylor.
I just noticed, like, in the first line, sorry, I processed slowly, so I'm still in the first line.
That's all right.
It's like saying the reason why heaven and earth can last long, like, is that they do not live for themselves. It's like they're not exempt from the same laws of nature that everybody else has to follow.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And I think we'll see how these kind of play out. So one of the things, if we go back to where Taylor brought us with the opening line, why does heaven abide and earth endure? here it's saying that they're not self-born. And a lot of what's being focused on in this chapter is the concept of self. And there's let's say there's a couple of different like competing ways that this could have been attempting to be dealt with in classical Taoist period. And that is, anytime you've got this concept of self, then you've also got this concept of others, right, that are not self. And how do these two mix together? And we're always going to find ourselves in a little bit of a constant struggle between self-interest and community interest. And to what degree do we sacrifice self-interest in order to be part of the community? And to what degree does the community, is it flexible on terms of what defines itself in order to incorporate different, let's say, individuals? So there's kind of like this constant little bit of a tug of war that goes back and forth. So if we're going to have this concept of self, we have to deal with self and community. And how does this function? So again, our kind of sparring partner is the Confucius thinking and text. And the way that Confucius would solve this dilemma is by saying that there's clearly defined roles, there's boundaries between, how people are supposed to interact with each other, what is due each other in terms of honor, what are the levels of, hierarchical arrangement between people. And that it's in maintaining those boundaries and respecting those boundaries that the harmony is brought about. Whereas the Taoists are going to take a little bit of a different direction. They're going to say that the way that you deal with the question of self is not through trying to erect these boundaries and all the effort that it takes to keep them in place, which is how they would have seen all these social conventions that the Confucians are trying to enforce. They would say that that's actually working against you. It's kind of like last week when we talked about the guy building the dam to try and control the river, so it wasn't flooding the house instead of just moving the house to a different location. And so they're looking at, instead of, how do we make those boundaries stronger and how do we enforce them? It's almost a little bit more about how do we dissolve them so that those boundaries aren't really there to the same degree or in the same way, at least. And so the first point here, when it's talking about heaven abiding and earth enduring, this is kind of like what Taylor was saying, that, they're plugged into kind of the same, well, we would talk about Tao within Taoism, but the same process, the same way that everything exists in the universe. Like there's this, again, kind of this idea that there's only one thing and it unfolds in certain ways. And there's these kind of laws of nature, if you will, this Tao, this way of being, that they're just a part of that. And that is why they endure the way that they do, because they're a part of that. And I think that could be understood in two different ways. One, obviously, the lifespan, if you will, of the earth and the stars that we see in the heavens and such are tremendous compared to human lifespan. And so there's definitely that distinction that's happening there. But I think it also has to do with this idea that if everything is actually one thing and it's understood that it's all just that one thing, then that one thing always endures, even though the various manifestations of that one thing may seem to kind of come and go. That's almost more kind of an illusion, because everything is just kind of going through this transformations, but it's still kind of this one substance or this one thing that is everything. So if heaven and earth were going to claim to be self-born, then it's essentially being cut off from that source, or it's at least claiming to be cut off from that source. And this would be that one of those boundaries that would have to then be, in a sense, battled. So if we think about the human, where do we begin and where do we end in terms of our boundaries? So we might think, well, it's our skin, but then what makes us up and how we exist is so much more beyond that, that it's really hard to figure out actually where the distinction is in terms of, where do I begin and where do I end, when I start to think about all of the different aspects of things that are coming to play in order for me to exist. One, I'm not a static thing. I'm not just a one thing that's unique and individualized. I am a process where I'm constantly, parts of me are constantly dying off and parts of me are growing, and I am in flux. I am constantly not just learning with my mind, but my body is physically changing. I'm clearly not the same person I was when I was 5 years old. There's always this transformation that is unending. It's just continuing to evolve. And that evolving has to do with stuff that's coming into my body and stuff that's coming out of my body in terms of nutrients and waste products and all that kind of stuff that's just in constant flux. I'm utterly dependent on things like oxygen and water. And both those things are utterly dependent on the fact that there is an earth, and the earth itself, in terms of how plants and other animals grow, are vital to my existence in terms of food. So all of that really depends on there being a sun and everything else. I mean, you can't stop until you go all the way back to kind of the beginning of what we refer to as the Big Bang. All of that, everything from that point up to now, is essential in order for this present moment to happen, including myself. So where do you draw the line? Like, how do you end up dividing that? Now, we do, obviously, for various reasons, create these categories or these names, these distinctions that we talked about, again, where within the Chinese philosophy, there's this idea of the 10,000 things, which are these manifestations of, what becomes with form as opposed to without form. And those categories help us to navigate our world, but they're in a certain sense kind of illusory. They're helpful, but they're not reality. They're just a way for us to kind of talk about reality in order to help us make distinctions between things where ultimately there isn't distinctions. So in one sense, then, we could say heaven and earth are abiding or enduring because they are not trying to make this case for being selves or self-born. They recognize, or I mean, that's really a personification. They don't recognize anything, but they're simply a part of or participating in this greater whole. So this would be kind of like the first part of this, the point that's trying to be made. So then when it gets to the sage or the wise person, and I don't know, to Dwayne's point, at this time where we're talking about kind of this classical Taoist period, if sage was thought to be something that was only attainable by a few, or if it was really kind of the goal of everybody, that's what everyone should be. So when it's saying like some traditions will go with the wise one, or they'll talk about sage, I don't know that they should be seen as kind of like this distinction where, there's only a special class of people that could ever end up being sages, and everybody else is, we're lucky if we can, get along. I think that the goal was that anyone who's pursuing this path, the goal was sagehood, which would be more along the lines of, someone who's mature in wisdom. Not 100% positive on that, but I think that's why you see kind of different ways that this is translated. So it goes on then and says, this is why those with wisdom, so the person that's kind of matured in that wisdom, are self-effacing. And then it's contrasting that with the body of life. So here we're seeing a real distinction between what we might think of as ourselves and this larger body, in the sense of the body of life, and that the body of life is what gets advanced when I diminish my selfhood. So if we think about from like an ecological perspective, we could think of, all life on Earth as like the body of life. And how is that impacted by my trying to be a self, an individual, something separate, versus as essentially a part of the whole as opposed to something distinct. And I think we can make a lot of parallels here for what we see in our modern day challenges when we're thinking about, the climate crisis or even just issues of pollution and so forth, is that we're having to deal with the problem of where do my self-interest conflict with what's necessary for the way of all life on the planet. And so we get to the same challenge, not just a social challenge, but one that gets into the challenge of, just living things in general. When we identify ourselves as selves, then we're somewhat at odds with this larger aspect of life. And there becomes a bit of a contest or maybe a competition between those things that maybe doesn't necessarily need to be there in the same way if I'm not creating a self to begin with. So then it continues and says they get beyond themselves and preserve life. So rather than making this thing about the sage in particular, by creating this distinction between the personal body that we can think of in terms of selfhood and the larger body of life in general, that paradox that seemed to be part of that first translation kind of evaporates, because now it's not like, oh, by stepping back or by self-effacing, I actually become self-aggrandized, right? It's saying by stepping back, this larger body of life is what advances, of which I'm a part of. And so I benefit from the fact that life as a whole is flourishing, but not because I am identifying myself as separate. It's because I'm a part of the whole that is better for the whole to actually do well. And then it concludes then with, why does this happen? And it's basically saying, isn't this because they are not selfish, that they can complete themselves? And so here, this idea of completing themselves is finding their place in this larger whole, as opposed to how is myself actually getting ahead instead of getting behind, kind of a question. Thoughts on that? I've got a few more things I want to run through, but I want to pause and see what you guys think of that approach.
I think it's easy to just say it, but actually applying it in real life is really difficult to remember all the time. Like, sometimes it's easy to just be like, oh, it's completely fine. Like, I'm consciously being selfless in this moment, but to try to do it all the time in everything and not have any desires and not have any like attachment to anything. Like, I'm trying to think of a life that would actually look like that.
That is the big question, right? So if I'm not a self, what am I? Am I renouncing everything? What does that mean exactly? So maybe that's a good segue actually to where I want to bring up kind of these final questions or thoughts on that regard. So the idea then of self is it's bringing in this concepts of an individual, something that kind of exists on its own. And we often will use the term autonomy or being autonomous. And the roots of this word actually have to do with essentially the idea of a law unto oneself is what autonomy means. And so you can see where these are certainly strong and important concepts within our Western way of thinking. It is all about, kind of like this rugged individualism and how are we self-made and how do we have as much autonomy as possible and how do we pursue those things. So we are definitely in the middle of a culture that very strongly pursues this idea of self. A lot of our economic strategies, or not strategies, but let's say philosophical ways of looking at things, have to do with the question about self-interest and how will we act if we're allowed to pursue our self-interest. So it's really baked into the culture that we live in. So this is going to be exceptionally difficult for us to kind of even consider some of these ideas, because everything in our life is really dependent on exactly the opposite. So we're going to have to kind of wrestle with this one a little bit. The other part here then is, and as we kind of talked about, is that when we identify and maintain this idea of a self, an individual, an autonomous agent, that we are then essentially cutting ourselves off from everything else, right? Because the only way you get to self is if you don't recognize how everything is utterly interdependent and interconnected. Because how else can you actually have a self if there's all these other pieces? One other aspect of this I didn't even bring up earlier, but it's kind of interesting from a biological perspective, that we are, as an organism, host to many, many, many other creatures. We, in fact, may have more symbiotic relationships than we have actual cells. And even if we think about our cells, inside each cell is these little what do they call them, organelles? They're the mitochondria, and mitochondria actually have their own DNA that's separate, right? It's passed on by the mothers only, but the DNA that we have is actually a different set of DNA. So they're, even at that most basic cellular level, we have kind of a joining of different species basically coming together in order to make up what we are. And if we were to kill off all of the different parasites and bacteria and other things that live in and on our body, we wouldn't be able to exist. We depend on them to even live, especially if we think about like our gut biome and all of those things. So even the question of, am I an I? It's much more like each of us is a we, because we're a whole constellation and collection of living things, not even a simple single living thing. So again, there's this distinction of what do we mean by individual or self gets a little bit tricky when we start to look at it from a couple of different sources, or perspectives, I should say. So again, what happens then is, if we're going to persist with this idea of self, then there's these boundaries that have to get created between myself and others. And the maintenance of those boundaries can be costly, right? It takes effort to maintain and create these distinctions between. And if that is working against kind of this natural flow, this Taoist tendency, then how does that play out when we're thinking about this harmony and balance with the Tao that is really core? So they would say, rather than trying to go full force towards how do we build and defend these boundaries, they would say that's working against. That's why we're trying to create these boundaries. It's more of a force, it's more of a battle, that what we need to do instead is think about dissolving or redefining how we think about this distinction between selves. So this would then be kind of like this selfless approach, would be focused on recognizing that we are an aspect of the whole, that we are not something independent from the whole, but we are a fully immersed and integrated and a part of this larger whole that we need to become more aware of. And so this then allows us to have, or we recognize still that we have this unique experience, but it's not separate. We still have, if we want to think about individuality in the sense of, a unique experience of what it means to be alive, because no one knows exactly the same experiences that I've had, because I've only had the experiences I've had, and the same with everyone else. But that unique experience doesn't necessarily mean that we're separate. It just means that we are existing in different locales, if you will, within this whole. And because of that uniqueness, we still have that uniqueness, but it's not unique in the sense of separate. So then, if we're thinking about how do we dissolve those boundaries, it's not in the sense that I would say, and this is probably an evolving thought for me, and there may be people who have different thoughts, and I'll be curious what you think. But for myself, it's not that I think that Jim ceases to exist when I think about dissolving the boundaries. It means I try to cease to think about Jim as not utterly connected with everything else. And so there's, I think within, especially our Western context that's very focused on self, there's this idea that an individual can get ahead. And the dissolving of the boundaries perspective would say there's no getting ahead unless everything gets ahead. It's like, it doesn't matter if I make the most money in the whole world if there isn't a world, or if there isn't any other people. It doesn't matter about getting ahead in that sense. I'm working against my self-interest, because my self-interest is to recognize that a healthy, whole human existence is being healthfully connected and in a harmonious connection with what we might talk about like the web of life, or everything that's needed for life. That if we don't have all those resources, then it's detrimental, and ultimately it has to be something that's more universal in approach as opposed to individual in approach for that to actually happen. So this is where that dissolving of the boundaries, I think, comes more into play, is to recognize that my good comes with others' goods, that the well-being of all, or the commonwealth, you might say, is important in order for any one individual to experience or to thrive in terms of well-being and health in that regard. And so the final thought then is, from that perspective, if we think about self-care, or, not in the sense that we're trying to recreate this idea of self, but in the sense that I still have this identity of Jim, how do I care for Jim? It becomes, in a sense, how do we care for the world, or world care? And it opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities for, this approach to have a tremendous impact on the larger world, because it can seem at first like we're talking about a very specific, almost individualistic kind of approach again, where it seems like it's all coming internal. How do I think about things? How do I, just become a better meditator? Or how do I, just live my own life without getting too concerned about all these other things? But that's really the opposite of what's going on. Taoism is not this quietist approach. It's not this, just me and forget about the rest of the world. It's much more about recognizing the interconnectedness with the world. So things that affect me is things that affect the world, and vice versa. I can affect the world by how I'm caring for myself, and that spreads out into other aspects of how life functions, because it's all connected, and you can't have one without the other. So I'm going to just bring it back to all of us and kind of open it up for some discussion. Oh, hey, Martin, how you doing?
Not bad. It's been a long time.
Yeah, glad you could join us today.
Me too.
So I know there's probably a lot here, and like I said at the beginning, I was kind of surprised myself when I first looked at the chapter. I was like, there's actually a lot here that's very intense. So I was glad I was kind of forced to dive deeper into it than I would have maybe on my own. But what are your thoughts?
So I've joined late, so I've only gotten the last maybe 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes of what you were talking about, Jim. But I've caught what Taylor was saying, and when it comes to how do we live this life, I've had this thought for past few years, when my partner and I, mostly due to the action of my partner, we have started being more and more involved in volunteering in our community and supporting our local community, especially the houseless folks. And over the past few years, we've gotten into a really interesting habit. And I think that it comes into practicing, not, practicing the selflessness and practicing actively doing the things that you do for others, and that they slowly become more of a second nature. For example, we were heavily involved in food insecurity, especially during COVID when it's all ramped up. We started looking into this, and we found that not only food banks exist, but of course, but also local community fridges exist in Calgary, where people bring in food for people and pets, and whoever needs, they just come to the fridge and take whatever they need to feed their family or themselves. And we started doing this initially just like, hey, let's just go to Costco, let's go somewhere and buy some food and deliver it. And we started slowly doing it the other way around, that every time we went to Costco or for groceries for ourselves or our family, because we feed our in-laws as well, we just, hey, let's get this one for donations. Hey, let's get extra for these donations. And as long as our income allows, that we are not suffering ourselves, so we're not coming up short ourselves, we spend the extra money and we separate our groceries a little bit extra, and as we go home, we deliver groceries to some of the groceries to the fridges as well, and it becomes more of a second nature, and it's just a second, almost like a second afterthought, not afterthought, a subconscious thought is, hey, let's get this for ourselves, let's make this for lunch, let's make this for this week, and let's get this for donations. And that's kind of part of that selflessness is kind of coming in almost now naturally and almost without any problems, and without the active thought of, hey, we should do that, we haven't done it in a while or something like that. It's just, as the more we practice it, the more it's there. And I think it's in the larger aspect of what you were talking about, Jim, about the boundaries and what does it mean to be yourself. It just feels like it's about priorities. Where do I have my priority? Do I need to first make sure that I'm not starving? I need to make sure that my family is not starving, and whatever surplus I have, I can take anybody else's starving. I can consider me is in the bigger concept of we as a family unit, as the people who are dependent on me, and we as a community, and the people who are, we are all dependent on each other. So that's what I'm kind of feeling it. That's how I'm kind of seeing it and interpreting it. And then I have one more thought, but I want to let everybody else to speak as well.
Did anybody else have something they wanted to share? Well, I guess we can do your second part then, Martin.
So the second thing that I've really understood 2 years ago was through, again, another YouTube video that got me thinking about what my success looks like. And it was really about success and how there's the two rules of the person being successful. You must believe that success is part hard work, that without hard work, it doesn't happen. And therefore, you force yourself to actually do all the hard work. But the second rule is that you must know that the first rule is not true, and that it's not only by hard work, but it's also by your community. And that you must do, once you are successful, you must do everything you can to raise and improve the community for everybody else. Because we know that not only you're successful only if you work hard, but also if you are lucky enough in your environment, in your community, provides you the opportunities for you to be successful, provides the luck opportunities to kind of play a role. And therefore, you not only must work hard, you also must and lift up your community around you. And I think this is kind of tying a little bit into it as well. And even though it's just about a success, it is just that I am not only a product of myself, but I am a product of my environment. And we've talked about it in the previous sessions as well. But I'm tall because I got predispositions, but I'm also tall because I got food that allowed me to grow. And everything that we may consider ourselves being us is just a product of everything around us. So the boundaries of self, or the definitions of self, I guess, are still diluted within the overall environment in which we are living and striving or thriving or not thriving.
Yeah. When you were talking about the business stuff, it reminded me of a political stir that happened a while back. Obama had made some comment, and it's a little bit foggy to me now about exactly how it came up, but it had to do with somebody that was claiming to be like a self-made business person, and the response was something like, "You didn't build that." And this just kind of blew up because people were like, "What are you talking about? I didn't build this." And I think, I'm just guessing that this is a bit what was going on with Obama's thinking, is that, if you have a business, and let's say it's a tire store, right? Your whole business is going to be dependent on something like there being streets that exist, that there's automobiles that people are driving, all of which are not things that you had anything to do with, but you kind of piggyback on that by creating something that fits into that whole thing. But then you've also, probably didn't build, your own shop yourself. You didn't, invent the monetary system that everybody participates in that allows all that money to flow and to build, business the way that you build it. And then you've got to have customers that are actually buying your stuff, right? And so there's all these pieces that are utterly interdependent, that are stuff that you had nothing to do with, that would not allow you to do what you do to make that money, to be successful, if all those other things weren't there, which included all the rest of the people that are involved in this process. So yeah, it's definitely, when you start to think about any one thing, like the cup that you're drinking out of, where did this come from? Who made it? Who mined the materials? Who, created if it was a mass produced thing, how is it mass produced? And how did it actually get to me? The transportation that happened and the different store on. I mean, it's just unbelievable, right? And everything is so interconnected, it's very difficult to draw lines, except for the ones that we create, which ultimately end up being somewhat artificial. They're helpful, they're useful. We don't want to say that we want to try and erase those lines, but it becomes problematic if we think that those lines are actual reality, that when we understand that they are a helpful tool on top of reality, then we can be more focused on, how do we support that underlying reality, that our classifications, our categories, our names on top of that are just there as tools.
There was a lot of this about self-made billionaires. Like, if you're a billionaire, you're not self-made. It's the people who made you a billionaire. It's your employees, the people you oftentimes exploited, that made you a billionaire.
Well, and even you got to think about the people who buy whatever product, right?
Yeah.
And the system that
Exactly.
made your product actually valuable. So, what good would personal computers be? I mean, to the same degree, if we didn't have some need to use them in a business context, or if there wasn't a, internet available, or all these other pieces that are necessary for, let's say, these tech giants to have existed, everything is still required for that system to make their product even relevant, not to mention all the people who actually pay for them. And what are the jobs that they do in order to have the money? It's everything's all connected. Well, we've got a few minutes left here. I'm curious what did the thought about self and dissolving those boundaries, how did that come across? Like, did that rub you the wrong way in terms of, we mentioned that we really live in a self-defined culture. What were your initial impressions when we were talking about dissolving those boundaries?
I think it's hard to do that without thinking that somebody's going to take advantage of it.
So what do you think would be some ways that you could structure things where that would be, well, maybe what would be an example of a context in which you think you might get taken advantage of if you were dissolving those boundaries?
Like Martin's example, like if he's bringing food to the fridge all the time, there could be somebody who's just taking advantage of that, and instead of using their own means to get groceries, they could just be taking out of the fridge instead of letting the people who really need it take it.
Yeah.
This is
So
actually, sorry,
Go
this
ahead.
is actually really, really, really common misconception. Well, I think in practice, you're right. In the global area, you're right. There's always someone who can take advantage of someone else. But especially when it comes to the fridges, it's a really big misconception. A lot of this is some observations from the volunteers have shown that this is not at all the case.
Oh yeah, I was
Yeah,
just using it as a easily grabbable recent example.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think one of the things that I've seen recently was with Haiti. I think it was Haiti or Dominican Republic or Costa Rica. One of those island countries were having a lot of incentives for people to come in and buy land, and a lot of personalities and celebrities were taking advantage of that to exploit people on the island at the end of the day. Instead of improving the economic situation in the island, a lot of the celebrities were coming in just to get cheap living and cheap labor and exploit people for their own benefit instead of raising the economic status of the country. And in turn, actually, because of the billionaires doing this, they have raised the income, sorry, the cost of living for the locals and ousted a lot of locals from their living quarters because they could no longer afford rent and such. So there's plenty of examples for sure.
Yeah.
That's awful. It's so sad.
When they exploring this concept from kind of an evolutionary perspective, and they're trying to understand, human psychology from an evolutionary psychology approach. The big question that comes up is what they call the free rider problem, which is exactly what you're bringing up, Taylor. And one of the things that's kind of interesting historically, within human communities, when they were, smaller and more face to face, there was a lot of ways that would kind of get dealt with. So if you're out, running around as a hunter gatherer tribe, you don't have much. I think we might have even brought this up as an example. Let's say I had a walking stick that I liked, or I used it for hunting or something like that. And, we're camping somewhere and I'm taking a nap, and Martin thinks, I really like Jim's stick. I'm going to go steal it. And, what's he going to do with it? Because everybody in the camp knows, oh, that's Jim's hunting stick. He can't exactly just make off with it. And if he tried to, what's going to happen? He's going to get essentially kind of shunned, because the rest of the community is going to say, you're not acting appropriately. You're not being, in a sense, social. And so there's a lot of incentive for, in this case, Martin, not to actually try and take my stick, because there's these kind of baked in pro-social behaviors that will generate anger against things that are not fair. There's kind of this sense about fairness that has to happen. And we also recognize that we're all kind of necessary for this little collective group of humans to exist. And so those safeguards against free riders become more complicated when we grow beyond a certain population where we don't have that face-to-face interaction any longer, and we start to have more anonymous interactions with each other instead of face-to-face as people we don't know, maybe across the world. And I don't mean simply because we're talking through Zoom or something like that, but it could be when we think about something like government systems and how they handle things like social security type issues. We all participate into that system. We're still all connected in terms of how we're helping to provide that support. But now how we receive that support is not because we're part of this community where we're healthfully participating in it and we're all equally kind of holding each other up. It's become kind of this anonymous thing where we don't know where that help came from, and we're not accountable to it, other than the fact that we're a citizen or we paid into the Social Security, let's say. But it opens up all kinds of doors because of this anonymity that allows for more of this free rider problem to continue. So I think part of what also happens when we start to think about the interconnectedness, and as we start to live in a way where we recognize that, it starts to bring back more of that face-to-face, where we're maybe involved in groups like where Martin's doing this, food insecurity. It's in the local community where there's more of a possibility that everybody's familiar with each other. And if he had, a family that's, really in a hard time with maybe a single mom with young kids, and there's another guy who's, let's say homeless for some reason, and they both need to get something from the fridge, it's really hard to like take something away from a young single mother with kids that's looking for food. It's like there's still kind of this face-to-face, this community thing that comes together that is really powerful. And there's another book I read a while back. It's called Tribe, I think. Anybody else read that book? It was very interesting, where it looked at, a lot of our post-apocalyptic type examples that we see in entertainment is that everybody turns against each other, and it becomes like this, every person for themselves kind of a deal. And he was saying that although there are examples of those, and often they were kind of brought about because of kind of some inhuman systems that were in place to try and do things, that for the most part, everybody comes together and tries to help each other in times of disaster. That the human superpowers, our ability to cooperate, our ability to have empathy, and that's what really allows us to thrive, because we can't really do anything much at all on our own. And so it's really when we get into very disruptive, anti-human kind of systems that allows for, kind of this rogue individual type behavior to really thrive. It's also kind of along the same vein. I forget the percentage now exactly, but it's a much higher percentage than I would have guessed about the number of people who are sociopaths in the world. And it's pretty well spread out around the world, but certain cultures don't seem to really provide a context in which they can thrive, because they really have systems in place that look down on individuals trying to take advantage of other people just by the way the system works, where they're more collective thinking in their approach as opposed to individual thriving approach. And that in our Western context, we tend to have a huge number of them actually surface in things like politics and other positions of leadership, because our whole political and economic system really favors that type of behavior. So there's a lot that can happen when we start to think about systems as well. And if we're thinking about them in terms of we're all part of this, and how do we have to, recognizing the impact of that system rather than just individuals being bad actors, goes a long ways towards creating a context that helps to eliminate the free rider problem as well. But it's not a simple solution. So I understand for sure the concern, Taylor. Well, I think that's about it for today. Again, I want to thank you for joining us at Kinship Cafe. And if you'd like to join us on this Zoom conversation, you can go to www.kinship.cafe and sign up for our email, and you'll get the invitation to the Zoom conversation as well as links to videos. So thank you again, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Jim.